Designs by Diane. Today we're going to talk about several aspects of putting your quilt in a show or hanging it in your home. Come along and let's get busy quilting. I have this log cabin quilt and I want to put it in a little local show we're having soon. So I need some kind of a pocket on the back to slip a rod through so it can be hung. Now I'm going to slide a 1" by 3" board all the way down the length of the quilt so that the weight of the quilt hanging in the show or hanging on my wall for decoration will not put any stress on the quilt. I also want to offset that casing just a little bit so that it does not make the quilt bulge around it, and we're going to show how to do that today. You need a piece of fabric the width plus an inch or so of the back of your quilt, and we're not going to be real exact with this. We want to spread our quilt out, and then I have cut this piece that matches the purple, and I cut it 10 inches wide, and I want to lay it out here, and I'm going to let it hang off that end of the quilt just a little bit, and then I'll let it hang off this end of the quilt just a little bit, and we're not going to be real exact here. Make sure you've squared up the ends. Don't pull it real tight. When you get it just a little longer than your quilt, snip it and tear it. Now I know I have my casing 10 inches wide because I've already bound this quilt. If I were going to add this casing as I put the binding on, I would only cut it 9 inches wide. So if you've already finished your quilt, make it 10 inches just to be on the safe side. If you're doing it as you put the binding on, 9 inches should be enough. Now we want to take this and we're going to just roughly turn about a 1/2 inch and a 1/2 inch in, iron it in place, and then sew it so that we have a hem on each end of this, and then I'll be back. In order to work with this purple material and then the colors changing on the front of the quilt, I'm going to use an invisible thread. This is by Superior's monopoly polyester thread. It's a good quality. You want to make sure and get some good thread, not something that feels like fishing line when you use it. And it will try to get away from you and curl around everything, so make sure you get it on there. Sometimes you put the little fishnet thing on it to make sure it stays wound around the spool and doesn't get tangled. The other thing I like to do is to take a piece of binding that was left over from some quilt. It's already folded in half, and I use this to check my stitches on. With the type of machine I have, I cannot adjust the bobbin tension, so I can only work with the top tension. I wind my bobbin, put it in there, and then loosen your top tension a little bit and stitch some. Look at the top and the bottom and see if they meet in the center of the material. If they do not, loosen the top or tie, whichever one you have to do. If you do have a bobbin case on the bottom, you can adjust the bobbin first and then work with the top. But do some scrap and get it right before you start. Now I have folded the edges in twice so that I've got a nice hem on here. And I'm going to sew with this clear thread along the left edge of just next to the fold, just enough to catch it, so that I've got a little hemmed end on each end of this. Make sure you have taken the time to fold the hem to the same side on both of them. Don't have one on one side and one on the other. I'm going to start sewing at the edge. I don't care where your needle is positioned as long as you keep it toward the edge of this little hem that we've got. We just want to turn it in a little bit. And I always put my hands on the threads and make sure they don't get snatched down in there. Look around to the other end and do it before I cut my threads. This casing will be on the back side of your quilt. If you hang your quilt on the wall, nothing's going to show except the stitching where you add the casing on to the quilt itself, and we're going to use invisible thread. If you have a dark colored quilt top, if you'll use the smoke color, it will be better. If not, just use the regular clear. Now we have one more step to do before we're ready to sew this together. Oops, I missed that one. I have taken the layers and folded them in half long ways, where the good side's out, the bad side's in. I'm going to sew this from one end to the other. I don't want to wind up on the other end with the ends not even. So I've pinned a few here. I went to the other end and pinned a few, and then worked in between a couple of pins so that I know I'll come out right. Now, sew this at about a 1/2 inch wide, wider than the quilter's seam, but not huge. You can use the width of your foot, whatever. It's not that exact. We want to sew from one end to the other, and I do take a couple of locking stitches here. I don't want it coming apart. Other than that, I'm not going to be too careful. Sew a straight line. We're going to sew from one end to the other. This is my casing after I sewed it together. Now, the raw edges are on what we would call the good side. That's fine. Then I took it to the ironing board and I opened it flat where the casing was, where I sewed it was down the center. And I opened this seam flat just because I like things to lay flat. And as I went, I centered this and I ironed both sides down. So now I have a nice folded casing. We're going to put this on the quilt so that this is against the quilt. We won't see that. But we also want to put it on the quilt in such a way that we have some extra for the rod in the casing where it won't bulge over it. So I'm going to take a ruler and mark a pencil line 1/4 inch in from one of these sides. I don't care which one, but it's the side that this bad is on, the raw edge seam. So go down with a marker and mark about 1/4, it might be a little more, of an inch down there, and then we're going to iron on that line. I have a ruler, and because this is purple, it looks blue on the camera, but it's purple. I have chosen a white chalk pencil. I'm going to put my 1/4 inch line along the edge of this casing, and I'm going to angle my pencil backwards and pull it toward me so that my pencil point does not try to push that out of the way. I'll go down a little bit more, get my ruler lined up, pull my pencil back toward me. And I'm going to do this the entire length of this side of the casing. I have my line down the 1/4 inch or a little bit more from the edge of my casing sleeve. I'm going to go back to the ironing board and actually change this ironed pleat to where it is right on that line. This will make it easier when we sew it in just a few moments. Now I want to explain to you what we have here. We have made our casing. We have pressed this seam down the center and opened it so it will be nice and flat. When we did that, we pressed a seam on either side. Then we made a line 1/4 inch from the edge, and we changed that crease on that side to where the line was. So we have a shorter side and a blousier side to this casing. The shorter side is the side with the seam showing. The blousier side will be the one showing on the back of the quilt. Your board will go inside of this casing, flat against the quilt, and the extra will go around the board so that the quilt will hang straight. Now we want to take this casing and we're going to sew one edge just under the binding of the back of the quilt all the way across. Then we're going to sew the other edge, which is the line we drew, and it's a little blousiness, wherever it normally wants to lay. We will have this blousy effect left over. That's fine. When we're done with that, we're going to peek in here and just tack this inside piece against the back of the quilt where your casing rod will have to go in here correctly. So let's get this attached to this quilt and we'll be ready to hang it. To get the casing on the back of the quilt accurately, we want it an even distance from either end, and it should not go beyond the binding. We want it to stop just short of where the binding starts. I'm going to get it even just inside the binding on one end. Put a pin there. And remember, leave your pins in place until you almost get to them and then take them out. And then finger walk, or however you want to call it, to the other end. And make sure you're the same distance from the edge, or approximately, and put a pin in that end. Now remember, this is one of the creased edges, one of the pretty spots. That raw seam is on the bottom against the quilt, and the blousey side is up towards you. Now we're going to go along and put a few pins in here, just enough to keep it in place. And this is just below the edge of the binding on the top edge of the quilt, and just inside the binding on either side. You don't want it to go further than that. If it's not quite there, you're okay. You want it to support the majority of the quilt. We want it to come just inside. Now let me give you a hint. If you know this quilt's going to be displayed, you can add this casing on as you're binding the quilt. You don't have to sew that long seam together. You put both raw edges up here, pin it in place along the edge of the quilt, even with the edge of the quilt. Then you put your binding on. You do have to sew your binding onto the back and flip it to the front and hand sew it, but that's not a problem. You're just doing the same thing but on the opposite side. When you've got your quilt already finished, it takes an extra step or two, but we're going to get there. Okay. Now I've got the top pinned in place. While I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and pin the bottom in place. And I want to, everywhere I have a pin, I'm going to pull on that crease and make sure it's flattened out on the bottom side, and put a pin on that side. So get that little crease across from the previous pin, pin it in place, and you'll have all your pinning done. You won't have to get back up in a minute. I have the quilt underneath the needle. I have it where I'm taking about 1/8 of an inch stitch from the edge of this casing, just underneath the binding. You don't have to have a real tight stitch, but you want enough that it's going to stay together. Especially if you're going to pick this out later. If this is temporary, do it with a much looser stitch. Get it even with the bottom of the binding as you go. Do back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Sew just until you get to the next pin, and then stop and take that pin out. Always stop with your needle down. I don't know if you can see this. If you get really close, you can see a little bit of a shininess where the stitch is, but other than that, it's invisible. Now, if I had had it handy, I would have used the smoke on this quilt. It would have not shown as much. But the clear shows is the best on lighter fabrics, and the smoke on darker fabrics. But from a distance, nobody's going to see this. I'll sew down this top seam and then come back and show you how to do the bottom one. I'm finished with the first seam, and I back stitched at the end of it. I'm going to pull it all the way back here and get ready to start on this other one. Thread right again. This invisible thread is hard to see. Okay, this time remember we're sewing we sewed here the first time. Now we're going to sew clear over here on the left edge of the casing. Just a little bit, maybe 1/8 of an inch from the bottom edge of it. Make sure it's in position there. Start with a couple of stitches. Stitch. Go almost to your pin, take it out. Don't sew over these pins or you'll ruin your machine. And then I even it out down here and kind of pull so I'll know where it's supposed to be in relationship to the other edge. Stop with your needle down. And remember, you're sewing on that the creases on that chalk line. You should have extra fabric sticking out the top of this casing. The loose side should be on the top towards you. Now I'll finish this seam and then we'll get finished with this casing. Remember, if you do this as you bind your quilt, this is the only seam you'll have to sew like this. The other one will be sewn as you put the binding on. So it's much easier to do as you're binding. Continue to the other side. And once you get these on here, it is so nice to display your quilts without having to clamp them or hook them over something. They hang so nice. I'm almost to the other end. Ease off, back stitch and ease off again. And we have our seam done. Our casing is basically in place. And it looks pretty good. There's a little dust bunny in there, but I'll get that out. Okay, now the other thing we need to do, on the end here, you've got this blousey end, but you could accidentally slip your quilt behind the back piece, and we want to go in between. So I'm going to rotate the casing up. Let me get you a better shot of this. Okay, I really have you in here tight. You've got your casing outside. Your rod should go in here. Then you have the back side of the casing with that raw edge on it against the quilt. We want to sew the raw edge piece against the quilt so that there's no way your rod can accidentally go between them. So I'm going to, while I'm here, I don't like to get up and down, I'm going to roll the casing backwards and just kind of come in here and stitch it a little bit. Do a couple of stitches and back stitch. As you're coming towards you, roll that casing towards you so you can get in there. Get almost to the other end and just back stitch. We'll do the other end this way. And now, your rod has to go in the right place. There's only one opening here. So we want to make sure that we get both ends done this way. Now it's ready to put our casing to use and hang our quilt. I have a 1x3 piece of lumber. You can buy this at any home supply store. Take some sandpaper and kind of knock the sharp edges off of it and any splinters. And our casing is big enough for this to slide in there very easily. I'm going to take it, open up that little pocket, and it slides right in. Center your quilt, and then this could be done with a curtain rod, dowel, whatever you're going to hang it with at home. But I'm going to show you how to hang it on a quilt rack. And now you see the finished product. You don't know what your quilt really looks like until you can get back and see it hanging with others in all of its glory. All that work you've done, you finally get that reward. It's hanging nice and straight due to the casing that we put on the back. And it's hanging where you can see the full quilt. Hopefully you appreciate all the work that's gone into it up to this point. Enjoy making your casing so you can display your quilts. I want to show you one other way to make a quilt hanging casing for your quilt. This is good if you don't want to do the long one on the back, don't want to have to sew through the whole quilt. It's also good for smaller ones that you want to hang on the wall, maybe children's type quilts that you want to hang on the wall, or wall hanging, smaller wall artwork that you want to hang. Depending on the size of your quilt, you're going to make your strips wider and longer. So you have to kind of know in advance what kind of a hanger you're going to use. Now this will hang over a rod, and the rod will show. So you want to make sure if you're going to use this method, it's a decorative rod. I have cut, and I've already bound this quilt right here, but we're going to pretend like I'm going to put this kind of hanger on it. I have cut a strip 6 inches wide and the length of my backing fabric. This was left over from a quilt, a little bit of scraps. And I'm just going to use this to show you. What I want to do is fold it in half. You actually can fold it in half with the good sides out because the other part's not going to show. We want to fold it in half, good sides out. You can do it the other way if you want to, but you have to turn it, and I don't want to turn it. And we're going to sew from one end to the other and just have one long tube. And then we'll cut them to length, and I'll show you how to do that. Depending how large your quilt is, that will determine how many of these hanging loops you will need. If it's a larger quilt, I would make them wider and longer to accommodate a heavier duty pole or rod that's going to go in them. If it's a smaller quilt, you want to size them down so that it will look appropriate for that size. You can try them out and kind of, check them out before you put the final touch on there. Now, we're going to take this piece of fabric that I cut, and I'll be honest, I'm bad about tearing fabric. I don't bother cutting it. I just measure and tear. Snip it and go. I've got my good side out because I'm going to hide my seam so it won't really matter. If you want to do it the other way and turn it, you can. I want a large enough seam to make it easy to press open. About 1/2 inch from the edge would be good. We don't need to back stitch. We're going to just do one big long seam and then cut it as we need it. Oops, I got a knot there. We have our strip good side out. We're going to sew from one end to the other. We don't need a tremendously tight stitch. This is really good if you have a serger. You can zip right down it really quickly. And sergers overcast that seam, make it really nice. Now we're going to pretend like I'm all the way down this strip. Let's see if I'm far enough. I think I can get a couple out. Okay, pretend like we've gone the whole length. And we're going to take it over there, and I'm going to do this just like we did the other one. I'm going to open it out, and I would iron it flat this way and then center that seam and open it out like we did before, so that we're going to have a flat seam here in the center on the side that won't be shown. And I'll be back in just a minute. For this next step, we need a few tools. We're going to use a tape measure, and we're going to measure the width of the top of our quilt and find some number that we want to divide it by so we'll know how often to put these strips, and that will tell us how many strips we need. I have cut these strips into 10-inch lengths. That is just what I decided a quilt this size might need. You want enough width to look right with the quilt. I could have gone a little wider. I wouldn't have gone narrower. The other thing is what kind of rod you're going to hang it on. You want it to hang down a little bit from the rod. So 10 inches seemed good. You can try one out. If you don't like it, go a little bit longer, but don't cut them all until you're sure. Now pretend like this quilt has not got a binding on it. It does have the binding, but we're going to pretend like it does not. We're going to mark with a chalk pen or a washout pen everywhere we want one of these, and we'll center this on it. We want to get the ends even, and if I had a mark right here, I would put this down here with the edges even with the raw edge of the quilt. Pin it in place. Put the next one down. pin it in place. Now I've got this raw edge side on the inside. You'll never see it once you get it done. So we will have these pinned along the back of the quilt and get ready to put the binding on. When we get our binding ready, we're going to do it just like we always do it, but instead of sewing it to the front as I usually do and whipping it down to the back, we're going to sew our binding to the back and sew right over these. Just pretend like they're not there, just sew right on over them and then whip it down to the front. When you're done, your hangers will flip up this way and you can run your rod through it and hang it on the wall or at the show, wherever you want to hang it. So this is a nice way if you want to mix these hangers in with the quilt and help accent the quilt. This is a piece of netting that you can get to go over spools of thread that are kind of crawly, decorative threads or the invisible thread to keep them manageable. Many times they'll knot up on you more than you want them to. As far as displaying your quilts, don't be afraid to display them. You want to use care with them, but as long as you don't allow people to mistreat them, they won't. You can display them in your homes. You don't have to have huge walls to hang them on. Fold them long ways and put them across the foot of the bed or across the top of a cedar chest. It looks very nice. You can get quilt racks. You can find those at yard sales, you know, people getting rid of them. But they give you a way to display your quilt in your room. You can drape quilts over the back of the sofa or a chair to help decorate your home. There are a lot of ways to do it. You can get a curtain rod, a short curtain rod, decorative rod, and fold your quilt and put it over the rod like you would a bathroom towel, but a little bit larger. So those are other ways that you can display your quilts in your homes, but don't be afraid to use them. One other thing, no matter how you display them or where you have them, don't leave them in the same position or do not put them in direct sunlight. You don't want them to fade. If you put them on a rack or on the back of a piece of furniture, make sure that you refold it in different places, turn it over, fluff it, do those kinds of things so that you won't wind up with certain areas bleached out or certain areas worn more than others. One other thought as to displaying your quilts. We do all this work and we want to show them off, but it's kind of hard sometimes. They make quilt storage units now with clear, I guess it's plexiglass in them so that you can see the quilts but you can't touch the quilts. And that is another way that you can store your quilts but have them on display all the time. And those are very nice. I have some friends who have those and they are just gorgeous. They have some antique quilts in them and they're able to enjoy them and let other people see them, but no one can handle them, so that helps a lot. One other thing, if you have a quilt that you're going to be traveling from place to place showing, I do raffle quilts for our local Cancer Society Relay for Life. And I will do a quilt for them to raffle, and they will put it in one of those garment bags you get at one of the Bed Bath and whatever stores. And it keeps it nice. It shows enough of it that everyone can see the quilt, but it does not allow people to handle the quilt. And so that's a good way if you need to take a quilt to show and you don't want people to get their hands on it. Your hands have a lot of oils on them that you don't realize, and they can leave stains on the quilts over years. So we want to be careful with them. I hope I've given you some ideas as to how to display your quilts and how to put casings on them so that you can hang them if you want to safely. Hopefully you'll be able to put some of your quilts in shows and share them with others. Until I see you again, happy quilting.